Today saw two Senate releases regarding different aspects of the investigation into the 2016 election and what might or might not have happened there. In the first, the Republican-led Senate Intelligence Committee released its report following months of interviews. Now, if you recall, a couple of months ago, the House released its version of this, and it was a pile of propaganda garbage. So I did not have high expectations for this one, and we're not gonna go too in depth, but just sort of the overall conclusion being presented by Chairman Richard Burr, Republican senator, who said, "We see no reason to dispute the conclusions there of the intelligence community. There is no doubt that Russia undertook an unprecedented effort to interfere with our 2016 elections." Went into more detail saying that there were at least three aspects to the mission that the Russian government undertook. One was to damage democracy, as they're doing in many countries because they don't like it. Two was to harm Hillary Clinton, who they apparently believed would become the president, and three was to help get Donald Trump elected. Now, in this case, the Republicans who put out this report agree with the intelligence community, but disagree with the House Republican report. So interesting dichotomy there. And this follows an earlier Senate report, again, Republican dominated, that said that it released their initial findings on Russian cyber attacks against US voting infrastructure, finding that Moscow conducted an unprecedented coordinated cyber campaign against the nation's digital election system. So we're talking about two different things here. One is a variety of different methods, including social media, dissemination of information, things like that, to influence election results. The other is to directly attack in infrastructure in terms of voting machines, registries, databases, and things like that.
So, couple of things here. Number one, the fact that they were trying to help Donald Trump and hurt Hillary Clinton, one is logical. Hillary Clinton was in favor of the sanctions against Russia, and Donald Trump kept talking about how wonderful Putin and Russia were. So even if you were just sitting in Russia and did not have a dog in the fight, which I think they did, you'd logically want to help Trump and go after Hillary Clinton. It doesn't mean that Trump is guilty.
Yeah.
Because Russia could want to help him. Bangladesh could want to help Hillary Clinton. If she did not receive the help, if Trump did not receive the help from Russia, then he didn't do it.
Or wasn't involved in whatever was done.
That's right.
Yeah, it could be happening and it could theoretically break laws, but that doesn't by itself mean that Donald Trump or anyone else did anything wrong here.
That's right. So, and to me, so we'll get back to whether they actually did receive the help or try to receive the help, which would be far more problematic. We'll get to that in a second. The second problem of trying to break into voter anything, registration, voter rolls, that to me is nuclear. That's not sending out a tweet or a Tumblr account or anything like that. No, we got to protect the voter rolls. We should have paper ballots. We should have those protected 8 ways to Sunday, not just because of the Russians, but because, yes, there are tons of sophisticated hackers, both in this country and throughout the world. And you sure the local yokels, whether they're in Connecticut or Kentucky, have got this figured out? And they have the best computer people in the world in all those different states, and they know for certain that they can protect against hackers?
Yeah.
I'm not convinced of that. So that's where we should be spending most of our energy to make sure we protect the vote.
Yeah.
We've got to have a real democracy, whether it's Russia, China, or corporate interest, or any other nefarious actor on either side.
Yeah, and just to be clear, while in that previous report they made clear that to varying degrees and at various times, Russia did break into some component of the election infrastructure of, I believe, a couple dozen states. I haven't seen any allegation that they actually directly changed any votes or anything like that. That is again a separate thing.
Yeah, well, it's certainly incredibly related. We just don't have evidence of that yet.
Exactly.
And by the way, in the beginning they said a couple states, then they said about 22 states. I then later read a report saying, no, they tried to hack into every single state, but got into 22.
Okay, so I thought it was 26. But
right,
yes.
or okay, maybe it's up to 26,
okay.
right?
Yeah.
So, red alert. I don't mean the old days of red alert, but in this case, seriously,
yes.
We've got to put all of our energy into that. Now, turning to the Trump campaign, did they in some ways try to receive that help from the Russians?
Yes, so the Senate Judiciary Committee released, I kid you not, 2,500 pages of testimony and documents having to do with the infamous 2016 Trump Tower meeting. I will now read all 2,500 pages. No, I'm not gonna do that. I pity the person who has to read even a small portion of that, but there were things that came out that were interesting. It doesn't fundamentally change my view of what happened. I feel like we already know what is absolutely terrible about the setup of that meeting. Donald Trump Jr. was told, I have information that represents a part of the Russian government's attempt to help your father, and he said, love it. I mean, we knew that
literally,
more than
exactly
a year. He literally said, love it. A year ago, people pretending that they weren't trying to get information from the Russian government. I mean, we're already done with that. But we do have more information. So first of all, one of the claims that has been made is that while Jared Kushner, Paul Manafort, Donald Trump Jr. were all involved in the meeting, they were there, Donald Trump himself didn't know anything. And that is his firewall against, even if we find out that all of his closest advisors and in fact relatives were involved in something nefarious, Donald Trump himself didn't know nothing. Now we do have phone call records that indicate that amidst calls with the gentleman setting up the meeting, Donald Trump Jr. was making calls to a blocked phone number, a phone number where we don't have the information for. He says he doesn't know who that was to. He doesn't recall if his father has a phone number that is blocked, which seems odd. I feel like if you talked to him on the phone, you'd notice once in a while if his phone number showed up. And so the question is, does his father know anything about what happened? And we do know, this is reported a year ago, that Donald Trump did get personally involved in crafting the response to the revelation that this meeting happened. If you recall, Donald Trump Jr. was about to be revealed as having had this meeting, and he decided to release some of his emails. The whole story came out, and then they had a response. And Donald Trump apparently was on an airplane and was helping to craft this response. So they asked Trump Jr., to the best of your knowledge, did the president provide any edits to the statement or other input? And Jr. responded, he may have commented through Hope Hicks. So again, Hope Hicks is how information is routed to and from the president. We might return to that someday. Trump Jr. added that he believes some of his comments given through Hicks, that's his father's comments, were incorporated into his statement, a process in which a handful of people were involved. But again, they are saying his father didn't know when it happened. Although I will remind you that inside of literally a few minutes after the end of that Trump Tower meeting, Donald Trump Sr. posted a tweet about Hillary Clinton's emails and how terrible and shady the whole thing is, which could just be a giant coincidence.
So let's make a distinction between between what we think happened, which we're fairly certain of, and what can be proven.
Yes.
So Donald Trump Jr. says, oh, does my dad have a blocked number at his residence? I don't know that. You call your dad all the time. How would you not know that it's blocked number? Of course you know it's a blocked number. That lie indicates, oh, he called his dad, right? But can you prove that? No way. There's a lot of block numbers. That's not proof, right? So you can't get him on that. So that's keeping it real. And then, but on the thing, on the issue of did Donald Trump write that statement for Donald Trump Jr. where they lied about what was in the meeting?
Yeah.
Well, he pretty much admits it right there. He says it was run through Hope Hicks. He apparently did have comment on it. Did you talk to him about that statement? I don't remember. Really? I mean, that statement was monumentally important at the time. They had just gotten caught red-handed about this meeting with the Russians, let alone today. And in that, whether you talk to your dad, the president, about that meeting before they put out the statement, you don't remember. Okay, whatever, it doesn't matter because he pretty much admits that yes, his dad wrote the statement. That's important because that's obstruction of justice, because that's Donald Trump writing a false statement, taking part in writing a false statement. So let's break down why it was a false statement. They said, oh, it was just about the adoption of kids. And this is the Republican, you will hear this on cable news. This is the Republican defense. Oh no, they just thought it was an innocent meeting about adoption. No. The Magnitsky Act is us sanctioning the Russian oligarchs. That's really important because then their assets get frozen. That's the money, Lebowski. And those are the guys that might or might not have something on Donald Trump. So that's not a minor issue. It doesn't have anything to do with adopting of children. They're like, you gotta lift those sanctions, and that's what this meeting was about. And the Russians countered by saying, oh yeah, if you won't lift the sanctions, we won't let you adopt Russian children. That's irrelevant. That's not what this is about.
Well, unless you really want a Russian child.
Okay,
that's extremely relevant.
Yeah, that's an interesting story, but that's not why the Russians care. The Russians care because they need those assets and they got to have those sanctions lifted.
Yeah.
So that's why when Trump goes in and go, no, it wasn't about the sanctions of the oligarchs, and it wasn't because we were trying to get information about Hillary Clinton, because then we would be receiving assistance from a foreign country in our elections. It was about the adopting of children. That's what it was about.
Yeah.
Now you're covering something up. That's obstruction of justice.
Well, let's talk about they're covering up. I mean, they can say we met, it was just about children, and that's fine. But then we find out through the emails that he was told, we're going to set up this meeting so that this person who represents the Russian government can give you damaging information about Hillary Clinton. He said, cool, I love it, and had the meeting. And so that is inconsistent with saying you had the meeting to talk about Russian children. And the committee asked Donald Trump Jr. about this. When asked why his statements were inconsistent, Trump Jr. pushed back saying they were all very consistent with each other, which is not true, but we will push on. The initial statement was discussing exactly what the meeting was about. It ended up being about that. It did not talk about what got them into the door, and I didn't expand on it because I didn't think it was relevant to discuss what the meeting was not actually about, even if that's what the email was. As more questions were asked and more information was requested, we released more information and went into greater detail. So he is hiding behind, I talked about what I am now saying actually happened at the meeting, not what I agreed to have the meeting for in the first place. That's pretty damn dishonest.
Okay, guys, break it down this way.
That's like saying, man, I really want to kill my wife. I found a guy who's gonna do it. I met with him, but then we went there and he was just really hungry, so we just got a burger. So I just met with him for a burger. No, you met to get a hitman to kill your wife. What are you talking about?
So the emails say, hey, let's go meet to get information from the Russians about Hillary Clinton. They go there. When they start talking about lifting the sanctions on the oligarchs, both Donald Trump Jr. and Jared Kushner, according to people in the room, get frustrated. In fact, Kushner is described as infuriated because they had come for receiving information from the Russians, which might or might not have been stolen from the Democrats, about their opponent, right? And they're like, why won't you give us the dirty material that we came here for? And you're still talking about the sanctions and then how you guys won't let us adopt children because of the sanctions on the oligarchs. That's so frustrating. So we already know that. But Donald Trump Jr.'s dishonest attempt there to cover it up says, well, in the emails I might have said ahead of the meeting that, yeah, I can't wait to get the information about Hillary Clinton from the Russians. But we went there, we just talked about the kids. So what about the children?
That's what about the children?
Oh, come on, nobody believes that,
yeah.
Right? And then finally, no, two things. One more defense of Donald Trump. Some people are saying, well, and there's evidence that Donald Trump was offered a meeting with Putin. That's true, there is evidence of that. But Trump did not accept that meeting.
Yeah.
And you could say, hey, he didn't accept it for this reason or that reason, but he didn't accept it. So you can't put that on him. So what that they offered it?
And even if he'd had it, they could have just talked. I mean, that would by itself would not mean that anything nefarious had happened.
Yeah, so these same guys offer a meeting to Trump. Trump's assistant says he's too busy. So no, that is not evidence of Trump's guilt at all. And then finally, we go to Jared Kushner, and Kushner says, meeting? What meeting? I mean, I was there, but I was bored, and I didn't know what it was about. That's my favorite part. So Kushner denied knowing what the meeting was about. The name of the subject line of the email that Kushner said that he would then attend this meeting about was, quote, Russia, Clinton, private and confidential. Well, I don't know what the meeting was about. I mean, it said Russia and Clinton and that it was private and confidential. I don't know how I'm supposed to deduce what the meeting was about.
Maybe he thought he wasn't allowed to talk about it because it's confidential.
Kushner knew exactly what the meeting was about. That's why he took the meeting. 2 easy ways to follow the Young Turks. One is hit the subscribe button down below. Then you're a TYT subscriber. And second is ring the bell. And when you do that on YouTube, you're notified of our videos.